Show your support for the Untold Radio Network family of shows and join in on the conversation by using super stickers and super chats on YouTube. Got a question you want answered? Ask it live via a super chat and get real-time responses from our show's knowledgeable hosts and guests. Help keep the Untold Radio Network shows running strong. We need your support. Send your super chats and stickers now.
Hi, you're on Untold Radio.
Yeah,
this
we
is
are.
episode 36. My name's Jay Katz, and of course, the beautiful Asper Sia.
Here we are
We
again.
have a very special guest with us today. I guess it's
He's
appeared
always a special
twice
guest.
before, but
Yep.
someone who's probably got more knowledge and a sense of what's going on, especially in the US, in the midst of our whistleblowers' disclosure,
Yep.
than anyone else. So the name of this program is Bill Chalker, UFO Crash Retrievals and Recoveries in Australia, something like that.
Something
Anyway,
like
I
that,
sort of
yep.
made that up there.
Yep.
Episode 36, you're on Untold Radio.
Okay.
Now, for the host and our guests, and I'm sorry about that disclaimer. I mean, really, that disclaimer is more for us than it is for you, Bill. Now, let me just state initially up front, we're broadcasting from stolen land here, part of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
Yep.
and we want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and we always have to pay respect there. Our guest today has been with us twice before, and we will make sure that that person is back as much as possible as we can, because I believe this person is a font of incredibly rational deduction when it comes to ufology. He's the coordinator of the Sydney-based UFO Investigation Centre, UFOIC, and Anomaly Physical Evidence Group. How do I pronounce that? Is that AP? Do I actually say AP? AP-double-E?
APEG, yeah. It's kind of fairly dormant at the moment.
Oh, right. Okay.
All right. But
Yeah.
he is also an incredible author and investigator with, well, around 5 decades of research, which marks this man as being fairly old. But if you look at him now, you can see he's still maintaining so much youth there. Can we pop up these books and stop knitting?
I can't.
Oh.
I've got a deadline.
Yeah, okay. But you've also got a program to do, The Oz Files, which is an
Yes.
extraordinary book. And then the DNA and other forensic evidence of alien abduction about the Peter Curry case here in Sydney, Hair of an Alien. And I don't have an image for the
Of the
incredible
alien.
UFO history keys examining the UFO controversy from
No,
a historical perspective.
Why not?
Why not? She asked. A very
Yeah.
sort of interesting question. Yeah, no, I
Why
did that
don't
as a kind of a privately printed thing,
Oh,
and it was essentially going down to a local bindery place and doing it like a print on demand, and anybody that put an order in for it, I'd print it out myself, very basic stuff, and then get it bound. And now that bindery has gone a bit more modern, and now I could probably just send them a file and they can print
Right.
accordingly. So, but it's sort of kind of like a coffee table type book, right? So it's actually I'll show it to you anyway, so you know it actually exists.
Okay.
Hang on a sec.
What it looks
Hang on.
like.
Fantastic. I love show and tell. My father was
do.
big on show and tell,
You're
Asper.
big on show and
I've
tell.
always been big on show and tell, and I
Love
love this library.
Yeah.
And reminds me a lot of Colin Wilson. He had the backyard shed. Yeah. Wow. Look at
Okay,
the
yeah.
size of this
Here we
thing.
go.
Yeah, here we go.
That is
That's
gigantic.
actually one I did for Hair of the Alien.
Oh, that is beautiful.
Yeah, well, a lot of university students use this mod for printing theses, for their masters or PhDs and that kind of thing. And I like the idea of getting it bound, but it's got all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It looks good.
That doesn't appear in the actual commercially published book, but one I liked was this is UFO History Keys.
Oh, wow.
And that's essentially just the column I wrote for the ufologist here in Australia over, I don't know, what might have been an 8 or 10 year period. So it's all my columns woven together with a lot of other things fed into it.
Oh,
but
that's brilliant.
I found that even charging something like $50 to $70 didn't cover the cost, in terms of time and the physical cost, etc. It might be cheaper now, but but I found it a much more easier way to get things out. But these days, people don't seem to want to buy books or spend any money, or they want it all free. And unfortunately,
It's that
easy.
problem of like the moment you tempt them with something that's easy to do, like a torrent site, there's no going back. But something in that binding and that structure will last your lifetime.
Yeah, exactly.
And
I really like them. Yeah, I really like them.
I love that idea. I love the tactile nature of hard media. And I've always had that visual acuity where I can go to a bookshelf and by the color and the font on the spine, locate the actual information I'm after.
Yeah.
And the problem is, like we're sort of maximalists in a minimalist world. And when you start getting books in front of books on your bookshelf, that's when we need to actually be elevated. We need a bigger shed. You remind me.
You're conflating this a bit because basically what we are essentially book nerds.
Book obsessive.
We love books.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm not conflating it because when I look at what you've got there, you remind me so much of Colin Wilson. And he had the back shed, and that's where all his books were. So if you ever did an interview that Colin Wilson was so fond about, you'd end up in that back shed and you could hardly move. There were spiders and moss and everything growing out of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that's... Go on.
Did you visit Colin Wilson?
No. I've just looked at an extensive amount of material. I was very inspired by Colin Wilson. I wrote to him there at one stage, and he's just always fascinated me as another person that looked at reality from a different lens.
Right. Yeah, I like Colin Wilson's writings, but I kind of would describe him as the legend of the greater side. Because most of his books, he'd have a focus, and then he'd go off on a tangent, and the book would be full of all the tangents, basically. And it made for a really wonderful book.
Yeah, and it made for a very disturbing research project at times, but he was quite a fascinating individual. I want to say that your two books are really important books in terms of Australia and research into this subject matter and worldwide. I mean, Hair of the Alien really stands out. But we're speaking today about Australian UFO crash retrievals on Down South Anomalies. And it's interesting in light of what's recently occurred in the States with our whistleblower coming out there, David Grusch, and articulating the fact that Congress is not aware of a deeper, darker web that leads to the retrieval of metamaterials. But you and I, as having an interest in this subject matter and you being an incredible investigator, are well aware that these stories are not new. Now, would you consider David to be the highest credentialed person in the last 70 years that has articulated a story like this?
I think he'd come very close to it, and all due credit to Ross Coulthard and Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal for bringing him out into the open somewhat. It's got to be a very difficult process, and that's why I'm a kind of a patient kind of person. I appreciate that there's going to be a long, drawn-out process here for actually getting to the stage where we will start to see the kind of things that we might be interested in, the devil in the detail, that kind of stuff. And I look forward to whatever comes out. And I'm not going to be one of those people sort of shouting that, put it all out there right away. I'd like to see it in a kind of a careful analytical process. And when it comes out, I look forward to seeing it.
How did you compare Lieutenant Colonel Corso and his story the day after Roswell that came out on the 50th anniversary of the Roswell crash?
Corso's story is a very convoluted, rocky road. And even the publication of that book, The Day After Roswell, had its own kind of controversial birthing because essentially the foreword written by, who was it?
Strom. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he was one of the oldest senators in the U.S. Senate at that time, and it turned out that the foreword that was written by him was the foreword for another book by Corso, not for The Day After Roswell. Right. So with all that controversial birthing, and there's a lot of counter narratives going on. While Corso sounds like an interesting guy, a lot of people got the impression it was almost like a book written to preserve, well, maybe to offer a bit of a nest egg for his family as he was getting on and all that kind of stuff. As for its factual basis, a lot of people that are closer to the subject matter than me have had mixed kinds of experiences as to trying to figure out how legitimate this kind of material was. And it's certainly interesting. It certainly goes to a lot of the narratives that have been long-term threads right through the whole history of the UFO subject. So I'm, how shall I say, I'm not entirely open-minded about Colonel Corso, but there's some interesting information there, but it's hard to find it in amongst the totality of the Corso story.
It was a very, as you said, it was a very convoluted narrative that contradicted a lot of the other material that researchers like Don Schmidt had pulled up, and in that way became very confusing. I just wonder how tainted that nest egg would be when you're tarring your credibility, your background by going forward into the public arena with this story. And you know what it's like as an author. You've got to have a runaway bestseller to ever see a financial return from a book.
Yeah, well, I've never written any of my books for that kind of purpose. Anybody who thinks that you can ride the gravy train by writing a book about UFOs, etc., you need your head read, basically. It probably... I don't think it went anywhere near even the bottom rung of sort of remuneration for the amount of money, time, and all the rest of it that goes into it. So, writing a UFO book is not an automatic pathway to financial success.
No.
Yeah.
By no means. So you really, at the end of the day, we're still scratching our heads about Corso and the validity of his story, but he certainly was up there credentials-wise, and we could historically trace his career, and it was an interesting career in terms of the narrative he was going along with. Now, there's one book I've spoken to you about many times that fascinated me as a child, and I think as a teenager, as a young adult, it really got my curiosity peaked there. And also I remember seeing John Pinkney on the Mike Walsh show. And that was the story from 1980 out of this country about alien honeycomb. Now, you actually put your foot right in there and had a great deal of research and a relationship.
Did I ever, unfortunately. Yeah, go on.
So, and there's actually, for people watching, there's a piece evidently of that honeycomb.
Yeah. So that's from my private collection of the alien honeycomb. But it was interesting that I gave a public lecture, I think, at the State Library on one occasion, and I think Jenny Randalls was there for that one. And I remember when I mentioned that I had this alien honeycomb material, and I'm prepared to sort of show people, there was a mad rush to the front of the stage to look at this material. So, and that's even after I'd sort of implied that it was man-made, you know. So there's obviously a lot of public interest in this kind of material.
Looks like a bit of bad copper art there. You know,
It was an interesting look to it, wasn't it?
Well, yeah. When I unfortunately, probably for John, the book Alien Honeycomb is a really interesting book in the sense that half of it revolves around a kind of an interesting kind of overview of Australian ufology from John's perspective. Now that to me is really the best part of the book. The part that's dealing with the alien honeycomb is kind of the part that unfortunately attracted my attention, and the publishers sent me an advance copy of it. Probably in retrospect, they probably wish they hadn't, but I got a copy before it actually was published, and I started reading it straight away. As soon as I saw the colour photographs of it up close, you know, I thought, damn, I've seen this material before, but not in a UFO context. And I'm scrubbing the head, you know, and as I pointed out, I'm an industrial chemist by background and training, and but most of my industrial experience has been involved in the food industry, you know, in terms of laboratory management, quality assurance, all that kind of stuff, and microbiology, that kind of stuff. So mainly from the organic and mainstream kind of food industry applications. But I knew of a fellow chemist who had a marginal interest in UFOs, and he worked for Siva Geigy. Now, Siva Geigy is into all sorts of industrial products and that kind of stuff. I thought from a material science point of view, he'd be one of the worthwhile guys. So I took to talk to it. So I wandered over to his lab at Siva Geigy, and I had the book Alien Honeycomb in hand, and I showed him the book, and he cracks up laughing. And I sort of said, well, you know, cut to the chase, please. You know, just I think I know what this is, but I've been scratching my head for the last few days trying to figure out what it is. And he goes off and he drags me into the lab and looks through the files, and he says, here it is, you know, and he comes out with this material data sheet on a material called AeroWeb high strength honeycomb. And then as I looked at that, you know, the penny dropped straight away that when this material was used widely, and probably still is, wherever you want high tensile strength and lightweight, you know, things like aircraft wings, fuselage bodies, all that kind of stuff, railway carriages, anywhere where you want a lot of strength, but lightweight and that kind of thing. And so my initial reaction to seeing it, you know, I thought it was in that kind of category, but I just couldn't place it. But you know, here it was. And then looking at the chemistry of it, you got sections that are made from ordinary man-made technology like fiberglass and that kind of thing. And as it happened, at the same time, another party was taking an interest in the book, and that was Dick Smith. And Dick Smith happened to be at that time helping form the Australian Skeptics. So he financed a researcher to go to Greenbank and track down the people that are apparently the source of this material. So we're running on parallel threads. Eventually I met Dick, and you know, I got a copy of the report and all that kind of stuff. And from my point of view, we had exactly the same material by then, even down to where in the photo within John's book, where this segment came from. So there was clearly a close correlation. And from that point of view, from a scientific point of view, we were pretty certain about our results. And if you read Alien Honeycomb, there isn't anything in the book that approaches a detailed, elemental kind of reporting of what's in the material. It's all kind of discussions, and even down to a transcript of a conversation with somebody who apparently is a physical chemist, but still nothing that approaches anything that, you know, when we're starting to talk about unknown elements and all that kind of stuff, you kind of think, well, okay, whatever. But given the public analysis that Dick Smith financed, it's very clear that there's nothing unknown about any of it. And so whoever was doing the discussion in John's book clearly wasn't doing it from the point of view of having access to actual data about analyses. And that's
And
what
you know
made-
what?
Can you, for people who actually don't know how did John Pickney come about to own this, to have this footage, this sample of material, and he was touting it around town as a piece of alien technology? Is that what he was doing?
Yes,
Well,
it
that's
was.
what the book was saying, and
Yeah.
it was a very,
So
it was a
what's the
much older
premise?
case, wasn't it?
So
too?
what's the premise? How did he get a hold? Did he give a story of what happened, where it crashed,
Yeah.
how he got a hold of it? What was the story?
Well,
that he
a lot of it
don't
came.
know.
Well, his co-author Leonard Reisman was apparently the more or less direct source of the material. Now he had made contact with a number of people who were told about this material, and along the way it seemed to pick up a bit of information that suggested that it might have had an unusual origin that could have been related to UFOs. But even when you read the book, it's very hard to figure out a kind of a close correlation between this material and a UFO event. And as I said in the article that I wrote there on my blog on the case and other cases in Australia, it just didn't have that kind of detail. The book actually reproduces a newspaper clipping, which unfortunately wasn't dated. Now,
No.
and that stymied a lot of investigation until people like myself and others in Queensland were able to locate the actual clipping, and that gave us a firm date. Now, if we had that firm date, we would have been able to progress the investigation a lot more quickly. But ultimately, because it lacked that kind of detail in the book, we're always stuck with trying to figure out the detail. And so eventually it all kind of clicked together. And even one of the people associated with the investigation in Queensland, Paul Hebron, I think it was, let me just bring my article up so I can read from the details. Great technology. Here we go.
Alien honeycomb. That's the problem with it.
Yeah, I know it. Now going down to I call the alien honeycomb affair, inverted commas, after it was not so alien honeycomb, and that was a title that Paul Hebron from the Queensland group had come up with, and he allowed me to use that title because I thought it was a very good title, and particularly not long before I'd been reading the book by R.V. Jones, who was the head of British scientific intelligence during World War II. If you ever want to read an extraordinary book about World War II and intelligence, science, and how it helped win the war, read Most Secret War. And in there's an anecdote about the ghost rocket stories, etc. And this is something that's a lot of UFO researchers are obsessed about as well. But the book was important from the point of view of highlighting an anecdote. And I've seen this in other public labs where people forget the basics in many ways, where here they are in a rush to try and capture what information the Russians have grabbed from the Nazis and all that kind of stuff in the wake of World War II. And they're getting these reports of ghost rockets, and the Swedes had told the British intelligence that, yeah, we've got some of these parts of the ghost rocket that fell off some of the ghost rockets. And Jones requested some of that material to be submitted. As soon as he received it, he straight away looked at it and thought, I think I know what this is. But nevertheless, he ships it off to Farnborough Laboratories in England to get it tested. And back he gets this incredible story of it's full of unknown elements. It's 99% unidentified. And Jones was kind of playing with the head of the lab a bit because he kind of figured out what it was just by looking at it. And he said, have you looked for carbon? And suddenly the chemists, must have been incredibly embarrassing for him. They didn't analyse for carbon, and it turned out to be 99% carbon. So a lump of coal, a lump, you know,
Wow.
a lump of coke, you know, and burnt stuff. And so from that point of view, that kind of is I think, a really interesting lesson for all those people that are jumping on the bandwagon of analysing all these kinds of artifacts, etc. You have to be extremely careful because the rate of development of new materials in the physical chemistry field is just exponential. You know, it just goes on and on. There are literally millions and millions of new materials being developed all the time. And if you come out with a claim of this material is unknown, you ought to be very, very sure of your homework, you know, and then a sort of a loose anecdotal story is not going to cut it. And unfortunately, John's story came along back in 1980, and, you know, I thought the history part of it that he wrote about was great, because he was one of the early founders of the Victorian Flying Saucer Research Society way back in the late 1950s. So full of lots of interesting historical detail. I would have much preferred to have seen a book like that, totally the whole book devoted to the history of his interest and involvement in the subject. But he inserted the alien honeycomb narrative, and obviously that seemed to draw the attention of the publishers and led to a lot of strong interest in the book. But very early on, I circulated an early book review, and in there I put forward the idea that it was aero-web high-strength honeycomb, and later on I was like, I wasn't at that stage armed with basically Dick Smith's full report at that stage. I was still waiting on that, but I was very certain that it was aero-web high-strength honeycomb. And back in the day, you're probably familiar with this long-running show, the John Singleton Show.
Yeah,
I think, on the ABC.
Another colourful Australian identity.
Yeah, well, I didn't even know there was a John Singleton show. But anyway, I got invited onto a debate with John early on, just within the first week of the publication of the book. But John refused to appear on the show if I was there to debate the book.
Wow.
And there I was at home watching the interview, and in my place, instead of, who was it? I think it was Dick Smith who actually got invited onto the show. Dick didn't have a clue about the details of the story, but he had paid for research to get the analysis. So during the interview, I'm listening to the debate between Dick Smith, who actually had my report on the book, or the early book review, as his only piece of information, and he's there debating with John about the story. And during the interview, when my name comes up in the middle of the interview, John says, "Now I wouldn't discuss the price of meat pies with Bill Talker, let alone talk about my book." And I'm thinking, it didn't go down well. And but here I am, sort of thinking it would have been good to have had a reasonable kind of discussion with it. But clearly, John was pretty fixated about it, and plus it was a brand new book coming out, and you didn't want to be getting it impaled by a kind of a critique or a criticism of one of the major, well, the focus of the title of the book, Alien Honeycomb, was probably the weakest part of the book. But as it was, a few months later, he was writing a column for Fixed People magazine, and Fixed People magazine decided to set up a debate that ran for 2 issues, which was called the Great UFO Debate. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't the Great UFO Debate, because the material, to my mind, had nothing to do with UFOs. But over two parts, I just sort of dealt with the detail. By then, I had the full analysis of the material, and it was clearly man-made, not a shred of doubt. And yet, John couldn't produce anything in terms of any detailed analysis. And if you've gone to the trouble of publishing that in book form, surely you would have had access to a lab analysis. Like his defence was that the only body that he would allow to examine this material was the United Nations. And so it was waiting on them to do the analysis. They wouldn't have even touched it. basically, and so despite the fact that it got published, there was no lab report backing their data up, as far as I could tell. He never produced one.
That is so absurd to go forward with that story, but it was probably his most successful book in a long-spanning career. And even though he was a great writer and journalist, he was a journalist that sort of sensationalized a lot of this paranormal ufological material, because he had a permanent column, as you said, in Pix People. And for our international listeners and viewers, that would be the equivalent of like Britain's Mirror, with your page 3 girls on virtually every second page, and always ran its ubiquitous Roadhouse and paranormal stories at the back of the publication. So it's not a publication that carried any weight.
No.
It certainly wasn't a peer-reviewed publication. It wasn't up there. And
I've got to say, in defense of John, though, of John,
good on you.
There was a lot of interesting material that made its way to him courtesy of that column.
Sure.
Yes, of course.
It's just a lot of that material didn't get to be the subject of careful investigation, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And John and I did actually reconcile towards the end of his life. I came across some files to do with the first Australian governor of Australia, and his interest in UFOs. Now, this was Lord Casey, and Lord Casey, for those that don't know the history, he was the Foreign Affairs Minister for most of the 1950s and into the early 60s.
Right.
And also had the role of being head of science, i.e. the minister responsible for the CSIRO, our premier science body. And in addition to that, his more clandestine role was he seemed to be a kingmaker in the intelligence world. Like I would have thought at the time that this was mainly the responsibility of the Attorney General, but back in the day, it was all about people and who you knew, and Casey had a very powerful influence on the appointments that went into the formation of ACIS, our Foreign Intelligence Service. In fact, he was responsible for sacking the first head of ACIS under difficult circumstances. But Casey had an obsession about two things, or a number of things actually. He was big on promoting Ian Fleming's James Bond books, but also big on promoting rainmaking. And the other obsession that he had was flying saucers. And he was seriously obsessed with flying saucers. And he used his ministerial position as being head of the minister responsible for foreign affairs, or basically used our embassies around the world to collect information about flying saucers.
Fascinating.
And I ended up going to Canberra and looking through his archives and finding a hell of a lot of fascinating information about a lot of quite crazy, extraordinary things. Confidential diplomatic exchanges at basically top ambassador diplomat level that seem to imply an acceptance of UFO reality. Here's the American ambassador in Italy, Mrs. Luce, I think. Can't remember her full name. I'd have to look up. You can find this if you look up Casey, Casey, on my blog, the Oz Files. You'll find the article that I wrote about Lord Casey and the files and that kind of thing. And in there's a description of how I circuitously came back to John Pickney, and we ended up having our renewal of a connection, because up to that point, I'd lost contact with John. But in the Casey files, during the 1970s, when Casey had retired, had been the Governor General, and I think he had retired by this stage, but he read an article by John, and John was very gifted in terms of literary skill. He was a great writer. There's no doubt about it. He had the gift of the literary skill of choice of words and all that kind of thing. And he wrote this column in one of the Melbourne newspapers And Casey noticed it, and it was kind of he'd gone full circle from almost accepting the UFO reality to being convinced by people like the head of the physics department within the CSIRO that there's nothing to flying saucers. But he kind of had a love-hate relationship, despite the fact that his wife had a sighting, apparently, back in a bullet-shaped thing. But we don't know too much detail about that. But in addition, there was still this interest in flying saucers and UFOs bubbling away. And when he saw John's article during the mid-70s, he asked for a briefing from the RAAF. And given that he was the former head minister and former Governor General, he got a briefing. But when I read the documents associated with that briefing, it was almost a perfunctory kind of briefing that anyone would have gotten. It implied that there's nothing to the UFO problem. Move along, Just,
Nothing.
There's nothing worth wasting your time on, Sir Casey. Lord Casey, you don't need to worry yourself about this. Anyway, he decided he'd have a meeting with John Pickney at the, I think it was the Melbourne Club, and he kind of noted first that John had kind of fairly longish kind of hair for admittance into the Melbourne Club. This was back in the day when membership was a very restricted kind of aspect of your resume. Anyway, he had that meeting with John, and I don't think that convinced him in the end that what John was writing about was entirely convincing. So he kind of accepted the assurances of the RAAF at that time. So that was a long-winded sort of story about John.
No, that was
Lord
great.
Casey.
And you know what? It's really important to me, and the listeners and yourself, don't get me wrong. I'm not putting down John Pinkney. He was like the keyhole drug for me into ufology. He was there so early in the piece.
It's the gateway drug.
The gateway. And what I really loved, keyhole, I'm just slipping up here left, right, and center. But what I really loved about him is that, as you said before, by putting it out there and picks people, he picked up a lot of other stories that probably would have been lost to history. And he remained incredibly consistent. But there's one thing I know from my film archival research is that he was a screenwriter and he wrote Thirst for Anthony Bourdain. And there's Chantel Conturi. Yes. And we actually introduced a friend of ours feature after 40 years. Rib spreader the other day. And the oldest actor in there was
Chantel.
Yeah, she was back on the screen.
She was there
during the pandemic. So, and in a way,
she's looking her bloody best there.
She is.
She really is looking her bloody best. And I've done a lot of commentary tracks with Anthony Bourdain on his films, but that was one of the most fascinating ones. And I believe that might have been the only screenplay he ever had adapted in his entire career as a writer.
I think he might have had other things there. I tried to explore that, but not sure.
Okay. Well, that's fascinating. And now let's get to the truth, which is Bill hitting one of the most incredibly salubrious publications in the world. I'm not sure if it's peer-reviewed, but it's certainly reviewed by the world. And that's Penthouse in 1988 with UFOs, The Ultimate Secret. And I just packed up dying at your blog site when you actually said, you could entertain the possibility that back in 1988 that you would pick up a copy of Penthouse just for the articles. If the articles had the gravitas of this incredible article, UFOs, The Ultimate Secret. But you mentioned
I don't think Aspersia actually believes me, but when I said that.
Of course, it was all about
it's a groundbreaking article. And you know what? You had with Tony Jones, haven't you, hoping that this might become an ABC News story, or even in our wildest dreams, a Four Corners item.
It was under serious consideration at that time to be a story for Four Corners. And the problem was that that was right in the wake of the breaking MJ12 story. Timothy Good had come out with his best-selling book, Above Top Secret. You know, there was such a huge rash of interest, which actually pales by comparison to the interest that's going on right now.
Yeah.
And we have the benefit of multimedia and social media amplifying any kind of variation of the story here. But back in that time, it was a big story. And that's why Tony came along to my place. And at the same time, here's Greg Hunter, the deputy editor of Penthouse magazine, thinking about writing an article about the whole thing. And then I gave him the 1 or 2 hour crash course on the complexities of this story. And they basically, I think they came to the conclusion, holy shit, that's pretty complicated, you know, and trying to sort of dilute it down. And then Greg said, look, we're still interested. Why don't you write it, you know? And I thought, okay, give me a budget and I'll write it, because in order to do it well, I needed to talk to a number of key players. And through that, I managed to speak to Robert Emenegger, Linda Moulton Howe, and to Bill Moore. Now, at that time, they were the 3 key players in the development and evolution of this whole complex narrative to do with the MJ12, the Ultimate Secret, you know, the UFOs that crash. The same, and as I said, looking at the first page of my article there, you look down and the first couple of paragraphs is like you're writing about the events now that are happening.
It's incredible in that regard.
Yeah, you're talking decades later now that this has come full circle and now is being discussed at, you know, across the internet, and it's got up to the level of the US Senate. So interesting times.
Very interesting. I think the problem with now is that the platform, there's so many different platforms. You know what I mean? And that's why it's not a concentrated, you know, where it was like, you know, the news on television, you know, only a few stations, no internet, no YouTube, none of that, no Facebook. And it was, you know, either newspapers or magazines and, you know, the television. And that was it for the news. And that's where everybody went to get. But now it's just so spread that, you know, they could be landing on the White House lawn and most people wouldn't know it because they're not tuning in there. They're tuning in somewhere else.
And it's a bit like the Truman Show now. It doesn't matter how profound the information is. People will go, well, that's great.
Well, that's amazing. What's on the other channel?
But that aside, it is such an incredible reflection, that article. And I suggest, and do you mind if we put a link to your blog site? Because people need to go to that and they need to read that original article. I
just lost my earphone.
I even love, oddly enough, Bill, you know, this is where my sort of artistic focus comes in. I love the artwork from that time.
Oh, the artwork.
I love that cat type. It's beautiful.
I might end up actually reproducing the whole article. I don't think there's a problem there, copyright, but not after all this time. And the artwork's brilliant. And I ended up, I think, despite Asperseer's view on this matter, I ended up doing another article, which was on, what was that on? That was on military secrets and that kind of thing as well.
Playboy?
It was
or in Penthouse?
Penthouse.
Penthouse, okay.
It was on alien abductions, that's right. So it was another early article on the alien abduction scene at that point in time. And despite the inference that we're talking about a less salubrious source than normal, they wanted a really serious article. And I gave it to them, you know, and surprising, they used the totality of it. And, you know, I'd be happy to reproduce the articles in detail because they are a snapshot of the time and where it stands. And when I reread that article after so much time with all the interest in the current controversy, there was essentially like a serious exposure to deja vu, like it was almost restating the current kind of elaboration of what the problem was about, you know, Cloak and Dagger saga and all that kind of thing. Now, I'm not saying that the quality of people navigating the saga at that point in time are on the same level as David Grusch. And really, folks, if you're interested in keeping up to date, I'd pay attention to people like Ross Coulthard and Leslie Keane and Ralph Blumenthal, all those kind of people. Even Keith Basterfield here in Australia, he's got a great blog, and he's focused a lot on that area, and he's paying more closer forensic attention to it than I do. I try to keep across it, but as I said to Ross on a few occasions, like, you've got to be doing this almost 24/7.
Yeah, you
keep
do.
up with all the threads of it. I don't know how he does it. But just to keep abreast of all the complexities of what's going on, it is a difficult task. And that's one of the things I opened the essay I wrote on my blog, that you're really dealing with sort of key things. And the key here is essentially you've got to have critical thinking. You've got to have a deep appreciation of the complex and convoluted history of related claims, but you've also got to have the capacity to do the deep dive in this subject. And that's something that people like Ross, Leslie, Ralph, and others have got the capacity to do. Now,
and you've got that capacity, Bill. You've always had that capacity to do the deep dive. I think it's just navigating the rest of life and trying to survive and work out there. I mean, I'm astounded. I actually went and had a peek at the Open Minds podcast last night with Bryce and Ross, and it's a fantastic podcast, and it really does keep you up to date. So we'll put a link to that there as well, but that link is on your blog site. So maybe we'll just leave that up to your blog site. One thing I wanted to get in here is that article seems to be parallel with the information coming to the public's mind there in the States, and specifically through one researcher who was groundbreaking in that regard is Len Stringfield. So was that around the same time as Len's? Yeah.
Well, the one and only MUFON conference that I got invited to lecture was back in 1987. And that was like a watershed moment, because two strands that kind of defined the UFO field at that time had come together in a big, big way at that Pacific conference. And that was the breaking out of the MJ12 story. And for the first time, there was a large number of abductee claimants who were coming forward on stage talking about the abduction experience for the very first time. And during that year, 1987, Communion by Whitley Strieber and basically Intruders by Bud Hopkins were in the bestseller list during the time that I was there. I'd already made the acquaintance of Whitley Strieber prior to the book Communion coming out. And he sent me copies of his earlier books, the novels that he thought in some bizarre way might have been influenced by his ongoing experiences, and that was Nature's End and I can't think of the other one. But there were a couple of books there that he'd come out with, and these were kind of novels, but it was a kind of a painful evolution for him to come to it. But basically, by that stage, I managed to get a copy of Communion, and when I turned up at the conference, there was Whitley and there was Bud Hopkins, and I told Bud I'm still trying to get hold of his book to read it, and he whips out a copy in front of me out of his briefcase and signs it on the spot, sort of thing. Away we went. So it was an interesting way to engage with it, and so it was really a big period. But at that same conference, Leonard Stringfield was there as well. But he was all in the background already. I don't think he was that well. Up to that point, a lot of his monographs on UFO crash retrievals had already appeared, and he was providing a stepping stone for a lot of researchers to engage with that particular problem. But, in order to re-engage with that problem, everybody faced the spectre of the notorious book by Frank Scully, Behind the Flying Saucers, and that almost killed the whole concept of UFO crash story stone dead back in 1950 because
I've always wondered about the veracity of that story. I know when we look at Newton and all those people, there was a lot of fraudulent stuff going on. But we must remember too, not just Roswell, but, you know, people that were astoundingly respected journalists like Dorothy Kilgallen had spoken about, you know, this stuff that she'd discussed with friends she had in British intelligence, that there were crash retrievals. I think that was like maybe 5 years later that her articles came out. But there was a lot of noise around that signal. And I'm just wondering, do you consider Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, completely fraudulent from Frank's perspective? Or do you think there was some noise behind that signal?
Yeah, I know that there's been some efforts to rehabilitate that whole story, particularly the Aztec story, but it is controversial. My thinking on this was he would not have been the most ideal person to pass that narrative onto if it was involved with a core UFO story, a real story. One would have thought there would have been a better set of people to write about that story, and because it came out via a Hollywood reporter who was big on scandal and gossip and all that kind of stuff, while it became an immediate bestseller, it then also went into almost a nosedive after the magazine article.
But then, would you say, Bill, that Dorothy Kilgallen was a person of that influence?
She was a pretty high-level player within, you know, the upper echelons of British, European, and American society, and certainly had her ear to a lot of interesting narratives going on. And as I said to you before, with regard to, I'll actually get it to you. Hang on.
We've got to come there with a camera crew. We've got to come there to that shed with a camera crew, man. I am obsessed with having a look around it.
Yeah. We've got what's basically like a Sylvian setting here at the moment. So Sylvian trench. Wild. Yeah, we've got a lot of bush around us. So hang on a tick. When Casey gets into using his diplomatic connections to find out about what's going on in the UFO world, one of the most striking bits of information, if I can find it,
I'm getting you off track there too, because we do need to talk about the skeleton of that 88 article and then move on to fascinating things like the Harry Turner story, which you uncovered, which is just mind-boggling in terms of the notion of Australia having some interest and the possibility that we may have dealt with something along the lines of a crash retrieval. Who knows?
Yeah. Well,
I find it astounding that we didn't. You know, such a huge, but I suppose, you know, most of the population is scattered around the edges, you know, the coast, whereas there's so much land in the middle, you know what I mean, that if something did fall there, who'd notice?
Well, when you start doing a test like the British were at Maralinga, you probably have the people there to notice if something is occurring.
Yeah. Well, there are... I tried to highlight there an early kind of listing that I put out of various cases I'd gathered together. And each of those have a kind of a story to themselves. But the one that kind of sticks out big time for me in more recent times is the story of the Nullarbor crash from about, and it's hard to get an exact date fix on this because a lot of this came out years after it occurred. And we're talking 1977, 78, thereabouts. And it was through an acquaintance of mine that she started telling me about interesting conversations she was having with a gentleman in Adelaide. And this was a guy who was a ex-army transport driver. And he continued his driving career, had an accident, I think, at some point. Not sure whether it was during his army time or during private transport work, but he fell on hard times and was having difficulties getting somewhere to live, that kind of thing. And it was during that period, and this is in the orbit of social housing and that kind of thing in Adelaide, that he got to know this person who was a friend of mine. And he started to tell this story of various UFO events that he was aware of, and it became clear to her that he was talking about stories that also involved himself, and one in particular that involved apparently a UFO event, a UFO crash on the Nullarbor, or just off the Nullarbor. And that's what started to prick her ears up, and then eventually she pointed out to him that I've got a friend, Bill, who'd be very, very interested in these stories, and that's where he started to balk a bit. And then eventually she encouraged him to talk a bit further. And I did get the opportunity to talk to him once briefly, but he was the kind of person who was probably felt that up to a point there were stories that he could talk about, but other stories that he shouldn't be talking about.
Right.
Particularly given the treatment that he received, allegedly. And but what was interesting to me is we tried to take that as far as we could at the time, and it got to a stage there that she lost contact with him, and we lost general contact with him, and we were always a bit wary of pressing it too much in a public way, simply because he had a concern about what impact it might have on him if his name got connected with it. And so we had to respect that. But then more recently, we learnt that he had passed away. And from that, Ross Coulthard kindly used his current contacts. You know, my contacts ebb and flow. And I felt that his contacts were a lot better than mine at this point in time. So he kindly did a check and verified that this guy was indeed serving within the Army Transport Division at that general times period. So we have that level of confirmation up to a point, but still it falls far short from an actual confirmation. But lo and behold...
Go on.
Lo and behold, I was also having ongoing contacts with a party that I haven't written about in much detail at all. In fact, I don't think I've written about it at all. And that's since about 2006, 2007, I've had contact with a gentleman who indicates that he was a senior member at a very high level within the oceanic arm of the so-called program, the program that operated, as best as I can understand it, a loose network outside of government, outside of military and intelligence, but largely an offshoot from privatised aerospace type organisations, but a looser connected than that, but further removed from that process. And that this was one of the dominant programs operating around the world. And over the space of knowing him since 2006, and I've had ongoing contact with him and met him a number of times and interviewed him, and I would actually consider him as a friend. But he's telling me this incredible narrative, both from a personal point of view of how he got involved in this program, but additionally how he was mainly a operations systems person that mainly operated at the headquarters of the organisation. He was never a field person, but only on one occasion he said he was involved in a field operation that took him out into the field of an actual crash retrieval. And this crash retrieval happened to be around about 77, 78 on the Nullarbor. And that provided what I thought was an interesting possible confirmation of having two narratives possibly about the same event. It may not be about the same event, but how many UFOs crash on the Nullarbor?
In that period.
Are we talking specifically there, that Euclid Basin, very close to the Western Australia, South Australia border?
Yes, we are. Yeah.
There's something about that basin.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of narratives there, and I extracted what I put into that essay from a longer detailed report, and I may publish further things about it, but it's, to me, one of the few stories that seems to collide together. But once again, even from both sides of that narrative, be it the army transport driver that claims that he and a friend, in inverted commas, a gentleman he referred to as Klaus, who, according to him, was a American of German origin, American citizen, AWOL, giving him a lift, and he was a friend. And both of those gentlemen were driving along to the army driver's destination, and that's when they allegedly saw this object crash off the highway quite a ways away. They managed to drive the vehicle cross country, pretty rough terrain, up to as close as they could get, and then they walked down to this location. And then when they arrived at the location, there was one part of the object that was largely intact, very substantial part of it, and they went inside that, and that's when they claimed that there were entities there.
Wow.
More, I think one or more that was dead, and one that was apparently still alive. The Klaus, the American AWL guy, returns back to the truck, but the other fellow, the army truck driver, remained inside. And at that point, he says that the person, one of the entity that was still alive, seemed to almost try to touch him or communicate with him. And that's when at that stage, all hell broke loose, and that's when it appears the so-called retrieval team appears on the scene. Right. Now, whether this is the same retrieval that my other informant is telling me about remains to be seen, but it just beggars belief that there'd be more than one, even one, let alone one is extraordinary enough. But if there's two separate events, you've got to ask questions, what's going on? And there's some interesting elements that seem to make it look as though it's the same event, but there are other things that run counter to that narrative. So I'm not sure whether it's the same event. But
it's a fascinating story, and it's in detail on your blog with a very mysterious photograph of this individual behind you with the face blacked out.
The blue man, you mean?
Yes, yeah. And that just astounds me. There's so much detective work in your investigation. Do you have moments where your wife says, Bill, I don't want you to go out and meet this person at dark night on that street corner anymore? I've had enough of this.
Yeah, not with this particular gentleman, but there have been some rather nocturnal, clandestine get-togethers that, upon subsequent review, I was thinking of possibly not the wisest move, but I'm still here talking to you, so ultimately most of those interactions have been interesting, and some a little concerning.
That's a fascinating case, though, and it's fascinating to have had that amount of time with this individual in your wake, and considering them a friend, you must have done some research to check out their credentials, and they've rung reasonably true.
Yeah, well, as he stressed to me, there's nothing about his involvement with the program that would be confirmable. I'm never ever going to get to see material that would confirm the legitimacy of the program, but he's told me enough about his own private life that I've been able to confirm. And from that point of view, you're kind of asking, why would a person of that nature be telling a narrative like this? And as he points out, he doesn't want that side of the secret life, the narrative with the program to come out, because he feels that it would impact on things that he values, that he likes doing. And clearly that would mess around with that if it got into the public domain. That's why I respect his privacy, I've had contact as recently as a few days ago. So it's been that's over a long period of time, but it's a very interesting story.
Very valuable. Go on.
I've told very little about that side of the story.
Yeah,
Mhm.
which is very valuable historic research. I hope that you have the National Archives ready to take all your research, that there is somewhere for that to go. Not that I want to see anything happen to you, but I worry about what happens to that material later on in time. Now, if I can just swing quickly because of time reasons, but there is a very highly credentialed person that you're able to come out and publicly state that had some very similar stories. And that man is a gentleman called Harry Turner. And there's a picture of you with Harry, is it? And
That's right.
Harry was a nuclear physicist. Am I getting that wrong? An astrophysicist?
No, nuclear physicist, yeah, nuclear scientist.
Okay.
Yeah, he had a lot of high level involvement. In 1954, for example, he was associated with Melbourne University in their physics faculty, but also he had classified clearances. And basically by 1956-57, he was seconded into the British atomic tests on the Australian side and became the chief health physics officer for the Maralinga bomb trials. And the problem was that when you read the histories and dig down deep into that story, it was essentially Britain's atomic tests. Australia was basically in a support role more than anything. We had very little control. Now, like Harry was telling me that during some of the actual tests, they weren't allowed to be present. They were there after the test, but it was pretty hard to miss the test when you're in the same kind of territory, but in terms of close proximity, they would be sent in. These nuclear safety team would be sent in full regalia to get kind of radioactive data and all that kind of stuff. But he was there for many years, and then eventually becomes seconded into the beginnings of the Joint Intelligence Organisation and the Joint, which eventually becomes the Defence Intelligence Organisation. And he became head of the nuclear science section of the Defence Science and Technical Intelligence Directorate of the Joint Intelligence Organisation. So he had a very prominent role, but amazingly, his UFO interest continued very, very deeply. And I was advised that he was using a huge percentage of his time. Rob Barton, who wrote the weapons detective book about his activities primarily as a weapons inspector of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. At that time, I think he was working with NATO, or I can't remember, but he had worked under Harry Turner in the nuclear science section for a number of years. Actually went out on a so-called UFO investigation of a crop circle near Canberra.
That fascinates me, because that actually says that there was, at some stage from that data, there was a recovery team.
No, well, I certainly wouldn't describe Rob Barton's excursion with Harry in Harry's car to check out a crop circle.
A recovery team.
Which they never found.
For it, at least.
Yeah,
it was a private recovery team.
Yeah, all due deference to Rob Barton, he would not describe that as a retrieval effort. So,
okay, well, I'm sorry about that. I have
he would crack up laughing with that remark, but I was interested in talking to Rob simply because I was trying to get an estimate of how involved was Harry on the UFO theme during his time with the Joint Intelligence Organisation. And I'm thinking 20, 30% maybe. He initially told me 80 to 90% of Harry's time was devoted to UFOs or flying saucers.
Wow.
And I went back to Rob and said, you shocked me. You really shocked me with that. And then he modified that and reduced it down to a 60 to 70%. He said a lot of his time, and I verified that up to a point in a limited way. Much earlier on, I had correspondence with Turner's immediate boss, a guy called Robert Mathams, or Bob Mathams. He was the head of DSTI within the Joint Intelligence Organisation, Harry's direct boss. And we corresponded for a little while there. And he told me he knew, he was aware of Harry's obsession about flying saucers, but as long as the job got done, which was the main focus, i.e. nuclear science and review of nuclear issues that came up, whatever the politicians wanted, they would provide briefing reports, all that kind of stuff. As long as that all got done by the team, he didn't care much for Harry's obsession about flying saucers. But when I asked him, well, what about the efforts to operate retrieval of foreign hardware, Bob Nathan did say that their main interest at that time was in retrieval mainly of Russian hardware, retrieval of and that kind of thing, and later at a later date, Chinese hardware, that kind of thing. And he told me in correspondence, I've got in writing, that they never really got around to determining what their protocols would be if, in fact, some of this hardware turned out to be of an extraterrestrial kind. So, it was interesting, and I have a feeling that Harry's UFO obsessions that were continued through his career path at the Joint Intelligence Organisation, that only continued on that basis while Bob Mathens was his direct boss. When Bob retired, Harry retired soon afterwards, and he was of retirement age as well.
Right.
And I very much doubt. Well, he did get up when you were referring to rapid retrieval teams. Harry did get a lot of interesting players on side, and I was able to speak to some of those people. Like what's his name? I can't think of his name, but the predecessor to Dr. John Farrens, who was the chief defence scientist, who I also spoke to. He provided a memo, or actually read the memo to me. He didn't actually provide the email. He gave me the date of the email and the contents of it, and it described the formation efforts of Harry Turner's retrieval team or rapid intervention team. They weren't about trying to retrieve a flying saucer. They were about rapid intervention into a UFO landing case, to be there on the spot. It would have been great if it was still on the ground when they arrived, but they wanted to be there present to get absolute data on the field, on the ground, physical trace, all that kind of stuff.
Soil
the UFO landing case. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Still, that's an astounding thing to even entertain that possibility on that level of classified operation.
Yeah, well, they had the the preceding head of the Joint Intelligence Organisation, the DSTI, on board, and the head of defence science on board at the time, the one that preceded John Farrens, and a couple of other key players. The gentleman, the doctor, the fellow that wrote the massive report on the Maralinga bomb trials. He was part of the team as well. George Barlow, who was number 2 defence science. I mentioned his name in the essay I wrote, where I quoted a number of anecdotes related to Salisbury as a site for taking crash UFOs to, and how an RAAF mechanic technician described being forced to work on some flying saucers or UFOs, etc. And basically, George Barlow's response to that was, we wouldn't need RAAF technicians or mechanics to work on this. We have our own. That was his response to that particular anecdote.
But the fascinating thing about that, though, I mean, it does in many ways, and this is in South Australia, I take it, Salisbury. It's a heavily secured, classified facility that in many ways mirrors the work that was being done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, Salisbury, that whole facility there would be a obvious location for that kind of activity. And I remember once going out there with a friend and associate, Keith Basterfield. We went out to the the front gate of Salisbury so I could take a few photographs. And we didn't knock on the door at that time, but it would be an interesting location. But again, a lot of these are apocryphal reports. You know, they're weak on documentation, and we've tried to dig down into them. But you know, even people like Quentin Fogarty, the TV camera guy or the TV reporter that was linked famously
and all respect
to
to let's hope they're friendly. He was an amazing individual. He's no longer with us, but incredible case there in the 70s out of New Zealand.
Yeah, well, he stayed with me on occasion while he was giving a lecture here in Sydney, and we got talking over a few beers, and he shared an anecdote of a fellow reporter who told him of the story of visiting Salisbury. So it was interesting from that point of view.
But you know what's fascinating, and I think I interrupted you before, and I'm interrupting you, Bill, excuse me, is that with someone like Harry Turner, he was stating that there, around those test sites, that there'd already been a flurry of UFO activity that was being told to him that was very similar to what was happening around atomic test sites in the US. Am I right there?
In a very fragmentary way, you're kind of correct. He did tell me certain stories, but not of direct activity. There was one case told by a British military officer who was present at one of the major trials, and that story seemed to be of so much detail that I put it to Harry, was he aware of this particular story? He wasn't. But the government archives do highlight Harry's name coming up in other UFO, UAP, or as the government of the day called them, UASs, unusual aerial sightings. There was a series of events that took place at Wewak. Now, Wewak was within the Woomera Maralinga area and was the scene of some very controversial trials, and it was the subject of a recent book. And those trials were amongst some of the more dangerous trials that occurred during the British tests. And I think we're still yet to see the full details. Now, it's astonishing that we allowed the British to do that. And we still today don't know the totality of information about those trials. And even Harry Turner was not privy to a lot of the details. Like he was locked out of a lot of the events, you know, like the British even seeded high-level radiation pellets into the environment, allegedly as a test of Harry's team to pick them up. And Harry's team comes in saying, we're picking up high-level site radiation. Where the hell's it coming from? And Harry, basically, to forgive the French, went apeshit when he heard about this and talked to the direct people involved. So he wasn't able to get a satisfactory explanation as to why these high-level radiation pellets were on the range. And all of that comes out in the official Royal Commission on the Maralinga.
I think the Whitlam government were really wanting that information to come out and really working hard at it. And it was a shockingly obscene period in Australian history. You've alluded on your blog there too, and I've read it before, that there was still a rather large Indigenous community in that area. Yeah.
Well, I think Harry comes up in that as well, being involved with trying to identify and secure Indigenous populations from the area. And the area was just never given enough kind of comprehensive kind of coverage between the patrols that were sent out there. The countryside was just too big. And there's all sorts of apocryphal tales, etc. And I know that Harry was involved with at least one of them. And I think they did their best to try and secure people and where people had been exposed to make sure that their radiation exposure was minimised through showering them down, all that kind of thing. So, you know, I'm not an apologist for Harry Turner's role in this, but from what I could see, Harry's role was from the point of view of the Australian side of the story, and never having sufficient information to conduct investigations the way they needed to do, because it was always restricted on by the British side. Now, I've
we
tried
weren't
to
in
dive.
charge, clearly.
Oh, we clearly weren't. Yeah,
somebody else was running that show. Yeah,
yeah. I'm
And
astonished.
Go on.
I was astonished. I read, this might make me very unpopular, but John Howard wrote a book about the Menzies years. He had a love of Menzies. And when I bought that book, I thought his first book, Lazarus Rising, was a great book, a great mirror of the period. But the Menzies years, I immediately went to find out how much detail there was on the Maralinga Bob trials, because as far as I'm concerned, that was the worst kind of situation of appeasing the British and allowing our Australian territory to be used for atomic bomb testing. I just find that personally horrifying, particularly if you grew up in that era. Anywhere in Australia would have been exposed to nuclear radiation. And yet here's Menzies of the day basically saying that there was no apparent injury to any parties due to these tests. You know, and it's just astonishing. It's totally unbelievable. And yet in John Howard's account of the Menzies years, it gets less than a paragraph. And to me, it should have been a core story of the book.
For sure.
And Menzies has been known to actually articulate, you know, flying back to Australia from Britain, and he was a real monarchist, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, absolutely was.
That he would feel nauseous in approaching the Australian landscape, and that's the sort of Prime Minister we all desperately need, I don't think. But what a frightening era. How many tests did they actually do, are you aware of? Is that ever become public?
I don't think we know the full detail, but obviously there was Montebello. There were a couple of tests there, and there was the Maralinga bomb tests, and then there's Emu Field. That seems to be the totality of. But there were a lot of people mainly focused on the major mushroom cloud events, but some of the other tests test certain parts of the I guess the bomb apparatus and the facilitating of dropping a bomb or launching a bomb or whatever. A lot of those tests involve potential exposure to acute hazards, and some of those less visual events were probably more dangerous than the things that were often the subject of a lot of the mushroom cloud footage. Dangerous times. But go on.
So what's your estimation when it comes to this subject matter and the work of Robert Hastings and a lot of people that say, you know, basically splitting the atom was a time when things sped up, and this anomalous activity seems to have some sort of interest every time we actually do something like that, or around silos, nuclear weapons, nuclear destroyers, that there's a great more frequency. Do you believe there's some truth to that assumption?
Well, I've been trying to explore that, particularly Robert Hastings and others have done a fantastic job when it comes to the American situation. But I've been trying to drill down into that narrative in terms of the Australian experience. Luckily, we don't have too much of a nuclear narrative apart from the Maralinga and Montebello and Emu Field. But, you know, we have Lucas Heights, that kind of stuff. We've had UFO events near Lucas Heights, that kind of thing. I had a good friend who was a metallurgist with the Lucas Heights who accompanied me in a lot of UFO investigations. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. There was the incoming call there for a moment. Sorry.
Oh,
Still there?
Okay.
Yeah,
yes,
we're
still there. That was the Atomic Energy Commission, wasn't it? On the phone.
Probably they shut me up or whatever. I'm not sure. But anyway, my friend there joined me on quite a number of investigations, and we were lucky enough to utilise thermoluminescence techniques, etc., to study UFO landing events, etc. And that was quite an extraordinary time, mainly through the 70s, that kind of thing. So it was, we were able to apply some of those techniques to those sorts of cases. But overall, in terms of the connection between nuclear events or nuclear facilities or nuclear infrastructure, there does seem to be some persuasive evidence that that there's some sort of connection. Just what it means is difficult to divine. But in terms of Maralinga and also Woomera were the two locations where so-called big science was released on a massive scale to do two key events, and that was to support the British missile program, and the other was the British nuclear program. And Woomera was saturated with UFO reports. The subject was so popular that they had their own in-house UFO organisation. There was a lot of sightings going on at Woomera. There was an early memoir about Woomera that said that there's nothing going on with flying saucers at Woomera, and yet the truth of it was that there was a lot going on.
So who doth protest.
Exactly, but us early ufologists obviously didn't know what we were talking about when we suggested that there was a sort of a reasonable case for these kind of cases. But the one thing I like about the modern scene is that there's a growing number of multidisciplinary people getting involved in the UFO field, and so either under the UFO or UAP umbrella. But
Yes.
I'm particularly enjoying the moment now that there's a lot of multidisciplinary inquiry going on, and there seems to be a tremendous catch-up going on. A lot of people trying to catch up with the totality of the subject.
Sure.
And you'd find that you'd have, like Ross Coulter, you'd have lots of people actually addressing you now and finding your research to be like the sine qua non that they could work from, because you've done such extensive
You've laid the
document.
groundwork, that's
You
for
have
sure.
laid more than the groundwork. If I can just quickly, before we end, digress back to Harry, he alluded to the fact, or did he make a statement that there was some research going on there into the notion of anti-gravity, anti-gravitics. Am I correct in that too? Yeah, tell us maybe a little bit about that.
There's been a lot of fuss lately of reports that leaked out, and you can access these reports courtesy of our government archives. But what people are getting somewhat incorrect is the context of these reports. These are reports written by Harry. Harry was literally inundating the hierarchy of the Joint Intelligence Organisation and Defence Science and anybody that would listen to try and get them to undertake a serious inquiry of the UFO subject at that time. And so he was using anything that he could to try and sort of highlight that kind of the importance of doing that kind of activity. And so those opportunities were few and far between. He was the JIO's liaison with Air Force intelligence. That allowed him to get a hold of all the files, etc. But as I pointed out earlier, there were limited successful attempts to develop teams within defence science, within the intelligence world. But I think, in retrospect, Harry was kind of prescient in the sense that he had the foresight to see that there was a problem that should have been dominating military intelligence investigations of this subject. The trouble is, all of that is seen within the secret intelligence world. Much of it doesn't leak out until later on. And I only found out about Harry during my investigations at the Department of Defence, the Russell offices, back in between 1982 and 84, where I saw his name come up in intelligence policy files relating to a report that he had written back in 1954. And then later on, I saw his name come up with events associated with about 1968, 69. I thought to myself, I've got to find this bloke. And that's when I started sending out correspondence and eventually get a letter from Harry saying, yeah, Bob Mathams and Asia and others are telling me that you want to talk to me. Here I am. And away we went. So I had the opportunity to talk to him a lot between around about the early 80s right through to the early 2000s. had a good opportunity to examine a lot of his files, and very interesting guy. But that report that talks about crash retrieval, that's not quite correct. What he talked about, he used the words a crash program to study and investigate anti-gravity. Now that doesn't directly imply that it was a crash retrieval program. And he and I, we had a lot of discussions, but we never really got into discussing crashed UFOs. He never really brought that up. But there were a lot of things that he could tell me that were, well, his take of it was that it wasn't classified. Some of the things that he obviously didn't tell me may have been classified. But he certainly told me a lot that makes for a very interesting kind of narrative on Harry's involvement. So I'm planning to write a lot more about Harry and his involvement with the subject, because he clearly was a guy ahead of his time, and probably the wrong guy. If he'd been around 10 or 20 years later, or 30 years later, maybe it might have got a more serious attention.
Right.
Isn't
do you know what actually kicked Harry off into going off onto this UFO obsession?
It was very early. It was very, very early.
So was it something he saw, or?
He said he was interested from 1948.
Right.
Wow.
And in 1954, he writes a summary report of the Air Force intelligence files and compared them to files that he had access to, courtesy of Keogh and others, of the American data, and he compared the two. And in this 1954 report, that was a classified report to Air Force intelligence here in Australia, he said that the reports suggest back then that these reports probably represented extraterrestrial craft. This is a secret report back in 1954. So it's kind of astonishing. And then, of course, Harry gets caught up with Maralinga and the bomb trials, and virtually seconded out to there for years, and then gets involved with the Joint Intelligence Organisation and continued his UFO interests, obsessions, call it what you will. But again, all those reports from the late 60s and early 70s, most of them were authored by Harry. And he had a lot of people interested, but it never got enough momentum. And unfortunately, at that time, it was the subject of a lot of realignment of military intelligence, and a lot of people were hanging desperately onto what was left of their particular military intelligence empires, and did not want to let go of aspects that they did not want to really be involved with. And this was certainly the case with the RAAF. The Director of Air Force Intelligence back in the late 60s was not an advocate of UFO studies, but he wanted to hang on to the UFO part of it because it was part of the defence empire. And it would have been better to have been transferred totally over to defence science. It would have got a much better kind of run there. But again, it's still within the hidden world of defence science, and we still might not have seen a fuller picture of it.
Do you think they sent Harry out there to Maralinga to get him out of the way, and maybe? No. Harry was in an unusual position. He was one of the major, well-informed sort of nuclear scientists of his day back at that time. It was just a matter of timing, and therefore that's why he got seconded into heading up the defence science or defence health physics division during the Maralinga bomb trials. He was just a qualified person at that time that filled a suitable role, but unfortunately it was a role that was driven by his Australian connections, but totally controlled with an overview by the British. Basically they were doing Britain's work, but being largely shut out of a lot of the stuff and having not much control over the whole process. But
that's an extraordinary piece of history that you've given all of us that would not be there if it wasn't for your astounding research. Do you think there are other Harry Turners of that vintage? And is there a desperation in your heart to chase the Undertaker before we've lost them to time?
There is a little bit of that, but it's hard to. Harry seems to represent the one person who seemed to be the most dominant and most prolonged in terms of his inquiries that I was able to meet. Like a guy like the chief defence scientist, Dr. John Farrens. People told me I should speak to Dr. Farrens. He knew it all, and I ring him up, not expecting much, and probably get him hanging up on the conversation. But we got into a really collegial, cordial conversation, and while we're having the conversation, he's going off to his own personal files, pulling out memorandums and memos about UFOs and Harry's work and all that kind of stuff. And he was the one that identified the memo associated with the rapid intervention team that Harry was trying to organise. But in addition, Dr. John Farrens tells me, I've thought of writing my own book about UFOs, but I'll wait for yours. This was back in 1995, I think.
Right.
And unfortunately, he died about 2 weeks after my book came out. So I never got to know whether, in fact, he actually read my book. But he was clearly interested in the subject, and it would have been great to. No, I said, don't worry about my book. Write your own. Bring out a book.
Were you aware that there was a draft? Is there any way to make sure that some of their research information just doesn't disappear into the mini skip?
Well, I haven't been able to intentionally go through Farrens' files because a lot of that would be caught up in classified stuff as well. But his private stuff, I haven't been privy to. But I got the impression that he was thinking about writing a book.
Right.
How far along, I'm not sure. But he did write a book, something like Panic or Don't Panic or something like that, about the uses and abuses of science, that kind of stuff, in the service of hysteria and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, he was a very interesting guy. But unfortunately, we don't seem to have seen that UFO book. That would have been great to see.
Yeah, it would have been.
You know, we've had some moments there inadvertently where we've been, we get a call maybe occasionally from the powerhouse going, we don't want to take this film collection, go to this house.
Don't tell that story. That's
I
heartbreaking.
can remember going to this house and there was a truck driving out full. It must have been quite a few ton empty back ute type truck. And it was full of UFO
magazines and material,
letters to researchers, and it's just heartbreaking.
And
to
we were
see
there.
That stuff.
We were actually there primarily for the 16mm films. We had no clue that this guy, who was an avid film collector, also had this amazing UFO, interest, and had filing cabinets of all kinds of things, and we were just tearing our hair out. I would have let the films go rather than the UFO stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Who knows what went to the skip?
Yeah. As a parting shot, I'll show you what I was actually shared with today on a loan basis. If I can get it into the picture somewhere on the.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see a archive box there somewhere? Where am I? Hang on, wrong way.
I love this. This is the most exciting thing to me.
Yeah.
Hang on. Where are we?
Round a bit
Be
more.
patient, humanity. There it is on the floor, isn't it? Oh, no.
Oh,
no, we've lost Bill.
Oh, no, there he is. No,
it's going in and out. You are on Untold Radio, and that's the excitement of this stuff.
Yeah, hang on. Where is it? The archive.
I can see it with the yellow on top. How exciting, Bill.
Yeah.
So that's just come through, has it?
Well,
yeah.
Okay. I haven't looked at that yet.
You're a historian, and this is what you've given back to this country on this subject matter is astounding. You know what? There must be many times when you actually cold call these people on an investigative basis, and they must be just so delighted that they're actually talking with someone.
Well, that's somebody that cares.
And also is not going to dive into the sensationalist realm, but it has some scientific credentials and a sense of literacy to them. It must be a complete delight when you're actually on the end of the phone.
Yeah, well, I just had a conversation before we started this with a gentleman who was a member of our Navy, and who had a very interesting UFO encounter off Western Australia.
Right.
And some of the things he said actually might cause me to make a reassessment of Bruce Cathy, of all things, because I've been a bit
really?
of a skeptic
yeah.
of some of
The
the stuff.
Leyland person. Yeah,
Because
sure.
when, in fairness to Bruce Cathy, when his first book came out, he did actually go through and revise them all when they came out in paperback. But at that time, I was doing a projective geometry course, and I managed to impress upon the tutors, etc., and the faculty to utilise Bruce Cathy's Harmonic 33 book as a exercise in projective geometry. And we had an interesting time there, but what we seemed to establish from that time was that the maths was a bit wobbly and seemed to lean into numerology more so than mathematics, pure versus applied. And so from that point of view, I tended to get a bit of an unfavourable interpretation of a lot of Bruce's work, but maybe he had something going there. But and that's emerging from this conversation I had with this naval guy just prior to coming on and talking to you.
So you obviously got a little bit more information to, Yeah,
this had nothing to do with Harry Turner's thing. This
no.
In between picking up Harry Turner's stuff, coming home, and my wife telling me there was a phone conversation or phone call from a person who had an interesting story to tell. So I spoke to them, and very interesting story.
There you go.
That is exciting. And can you just give us the name of your blog site? We will put a link there, but just in case people want to rapidly go there, just tell us how they find your blog.
The Oz Files, that's OZ Files, all one word, .blogspot.com.
Okay.
Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you, and this may be a highly contentious and personal question, how has your wife coped with this subject and this interest over the years? And is she interested? Has she had experiences?
Well,
she was a psychologist and came to an early UFO meeting, and that's how we encountered each other to begin with.
Okay.
But it was interesting.
Training.
No, not quite like that, but yeah. But that's how the connection began.
Okay.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm sorry to actually step over that personal line. Bill, I want to thank you yet again on behalf of Asper and myself, the Untold Radio Network, for just the generosity of your spirit, the caliber of your research, and the time that you've given us today. Every time I speak to you or do an interview with you, we're profoundly uplifted, and we realize that we do need to actually stand back from this and look at the people that are qualified to actually discuss this properly, and you're one of those major players. And I know that many people in this country that are doing astounding research like Ross Coulter there, they've all been inspired by your research in the past. It's an incredible legacy, and I just thank you so much for being part of this episode of Untold Radio.
Yep, well, still standing and still at it, so all good.
Okay.
Okay, well, you take very good care. We'll see what unfolds in the future.
Yes, while Bill goes off and rifles through his box of goodies.
I'm so excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We will say our goodbyes, so you can go, Bill, if you want to,
if you need a break there. Do you want to put your knitting needles down? You have got a big knitting project you've got to do.
That's how much I knitted.
Yeah, I didn't hear anything from Anton today.
No, we locked him. We locked him up the front,
which we hate to do.
I know,
but we've had to do that. No, thank you for even mentioning Anton's name.
But he was screaming before we even started.
He's a much loved family member, but he's getting very old and cantankerous.
I loved his presence during the movie show that you did, where it sounded like almost Lovecraftian, in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
It was really good.
Was screaming.
That's it.
Yep.
All right, Bill.
All right.
Well, please.
Thanks, Bill.
Keep in touch. Anything we can do for you, give us a tingle, and all the best to you and that family. And thank you very much for your valuable time today.
Yeah.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, where are you here?
Well, I'm actually going down
and
to. Oh yes, all right. We're going to
go.
So
I don't think we'll do Robert Anton Wilson, but let's do the membership for the astounding Untold Radio, and then we'll just come back and say goodnight.
All right.
And
So what are we
good
doing?
day. We're actually going to our membership promo,
Oh,
talking about all
yes.
the trinkets and stuff.
Yeah.
Do I have to keep navigating you there, my love?
I've got so many things down there in the bottom now.
Yeah.
I used to have 2. Now there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things there.
Look, it's really important to
I know.
actually find the books Oz Files
Yep.
and Hair of the Alien. It's really important to go to Bill's blog site.
Yeah.
You know, you stick your foot
It's
into the water
fascinating
of
reading that. It really is.
ufology,
Yeah,
and you
absolutely.
become a controversial figure because not everyone's going to agree with you
No.
and are happy with you when you deflate someone's
Well, you know
alien
what?
honeycomb with truth.
But it's not in just ufology. It's in every field. Everybody has a different way, has got a different filter at looking things. And,
Yeah.
you know, depending on their perspective and their cultural background and a whole bunch of things, everyone has got a slightly different way of looking at things. And that's allowed. We're
And that
actually
should be fine.
allowed.
Yeah.
And it actually shouldn't make you feel like just because they don't agree with how you think that you need to go off at them. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, you agree, like that's what you believe in, that's fine. And this is what I'll believe in, and that's fine. And we can still come together and talk and converse and be human to each other, you know?
Yeah. I want to
So-
thank everyone that's been listening and watching. I want to thank Malcolm and that undying partner.
Oh, yes.
And as you can see, Malcolm there, that's just a tiny window into what my wife's like. I usually just sit here
I
and
usually
nod
rant at
for
him,
hours.
hey,
Yeah.
hey,
And
Oh
I
my
love
God.
her for that because it keeps our relationship alive. But
it does.
Malcolm, it's killing me.
Oh,
No,
stop
no,
it.
it's killing
All
me
right.
with kindness.
I am going to do the promo and then we'll be back to say goodbye and our end credits.
Hey, Untold Radio Network fans. Want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
I love that voice. And you know what, Alex and Doug, we've supported that film. We want a Bigfoot. What do we want? One of those.
Was it a diorama?
It's a Bigfoot diorama of like something like Sasquatch Outpost
Oh,
that
yeah,
Jim
something
has.
like that.
So
I love
your
something.
Bigfoot store.
Like I need more
Yeah.
stuff in this house.
Yeah, we
but
need
anyway.
the Down South Anomalies T-shirt.
Yeah.
We need the hoodies.
I don't
We
need any
need the
more
pajama
t-shirts.
one suit. That's what I want. But you know, the one
Yeah.
thing we do need is to keep you happy
Mhm.
and, you know, satisfied that we've actually delivered what is an interesting perspective into the ufological conundrum. You have been on Down South Anomalies. My name's Jay Katz.
And I'm Aspasia.
Yeah.
And we'll be back next week.
yeah, this was episode 36,
Wow.
Australian UFO Crash
Getting some-
Retrievals.
Yeah.
Check out Bill's work. He's not just an industrial chemist, an incredible author, worldwide lecturer. I want to get him back because he's done some of the most definitive work in the world, traveled there extensively
Mhm.
on the Asian UFO
Oh,
experience.
yes, that's right.
And
I
we-
remember when he was going to China.
yeah, looking
Yeah.
at those mummies
right.
that were uncovered.
Absolutely. All right. We'll
All
see you
right.
next week. Bye.
Take good care.